Forbes Books presents Leading What Matters Most, the podcast that helps you change behaviors, improve performance, and unlock the potential of your people. Here's Phil Geldart.
Hi, Victoria. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
So Victoria is a courageous advocate for over 20 years, being nationally acclaimed for accelerating progress during crises, driving systemic change, including a very successful 14-year career at Papa John's International, where she ultimately became the first person to lead their diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, incredibly successfully, I might add, and serves on numerous nonprofit boards, cultivating tomorrow's leaders. So Victoria, tremendous amount of experience, and we're delighted to have you. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I want to kick us off with what you see as the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging in the business world today. How do you see it's evolved? And where do you think it could be and should be? So that'll take us for about an hour and a half.
Absolutely, yes. So since I got into the space, I've seen it go from just kind of check the box, do we have diverse people on the team, very compliance-driven, things like that. When I got into the space, I started to see it kind of evolve more into supplier diversity initiatives. Is the company truly an inclusive environment for all people? It's really, really grown and expanded. It's been great to be a part of. It's not an easy role. It's not an easy career path to choose. There's a lot of ups and downs in it, but it's probably the most rewarding work I've ever done. As I've stayed in this space, I see it evolving more and more into the business, growing beyond human resources, going into whether it's legal, community engagement, marketing, branding, consumers, all those things. And I think if this space is going to sustain and see it continue to grow, we're going to see it continue to evolve more and more outside of just HR or compliance and into the business.
And how are you seeing that manifested on a day-to-day basis in terms of the difference that leaders are making in terms of their modeling of that behavior, perhaps, or in coaching it? How do you see that once it leaves the HR sort of required into really becoming part of a company?
Yeah, I think if it's really going to work, it's got to be everyone's job. But I think that gets a little complicated sometimes. So often it starts off as the job of one, typically the chief diversity officer or someone involved in that work. Or even I've seen at some companies, if they're kind of new to the space, it might be in the hands of a committee or various team members. But if leadership, I think, is what's really critical to not just be involved in the work, but to truly own the work. I often say that the true diversity officer of a company is not the CDO, it's the CEO, right? And having that board level involvement and engagement, that's how we're going to see it sustained. So when those leaders take an active role in the work, a leadership role in the work, and ownership of the work, I think that's when you're going to really see it take off in those companies. I don't think the role of the CDO is going away, personally, anytime soon, but I think those people are critical to help continue to expand how to do it. So it's not whether or not at this point in 2023, right, should you be doing it? I think that's a yes. It's how do you do it? How does it continue to evolve? How do you make sure it's effective and sustainable inside your organization?
Okay, which leads to a question here. I'm not sure I can articulate it correctly, but as you know, Eagles Flight does a lot of work in the space, and we come up against clients who would say, well, for us, it's a check the box exercise. For us, it's we've got to do it. And they come to us to see, so how do we carry beyond that? But let me see if I can, what I'm really trying to get at is, what do you see as necessary to actually make an honest to goodness difference and a true appreciation of the impact that understanding this whole area can have, rather than, yes, we have to do it. Yes, it's just flavor of the month. Like, how do we go from an awareness to an actual conviction about this should be part of our everyday life?
Again, I think it's that CEO level ownership. I had the privilege of working with an incredible CEO at Beam Suntory, Albert Bellotti. And I remember doing my interview phase, I heard all the typical questions, right, you would get, and a lot of leaders know how to say the right thing. Something that he did that was very different, it was attached to his personal legacy. And that was new for me to experience and see inside of a leader that deeply rooted within him was that he wanted to leave a legacy, that this was going to be an inclusive organization, a diverse organization that would get it right. And he understood they'd been on a journey for a long time, still are. And you're going to have some wins and some losses along the way. But that type of conviction from the top was critical. And then also requiring it of your leadership team, right? And not let people, quote unquote, phone it in, right? Or just check the box and say, we're doing it. What does that really look like? And often, he would hold people accountable, not me. I was there to help guide, help equip leaders with the tools to do the work. But at the end of the day, the CEO held people accountable to if it was happening or not, and he would call them on it. That's not easy or digestible often in organizations to see that happen. But just like you would in any other part of the business, if it's finance, if it's sales, if other things aren't going right, they're going to step in and see them do the same thing. And so this space was also very critical. So as I've seen other leaders and other organizations kind of do the same thing to own it from the very top, require it. Is it showing up in your quarterly board meetings? Is it showing up in your ELT meetings? Is it a topic of discussion that stays consistent? Are you honest with yourselves? A lot of times it's easy to paint a rose-colored picture and keep telling, employees the same messaging that we're committed. But do employees see that you're committed? Do your consumers see you walking the talk and not just talking it? And when you're not getting it right, owning it. I'm a member of the Executive Leadership Council, and every year we have our CEO Game Changer Summit for just CEOs. And so to sit in the room and hear other CEOs talk to each other about how they hold their own teams accountable for this work was so inspiring and encouraging for me to be a part of. But just to hear how some were vulnerable. Sometimes they don't get it right. They think they're doing the right thing, or they don't have the right people on the team, or inviting in the right level of agitation and disruption. And then there are a lot of CEOs out there that are trying to get it right. They'll own when they make mistakes, and will course correct along the way.
So when you talk about getting it right, what behaviors was that CEO looking for that you would be able to say, yep, we've got it right now? What would he see differently than perhaps 5 years ago?
I think first, looking around the table, is there people different than you? Is there representation from other areas? Is there ways to expand representation? So I don't think it's all about, just filling quotas or firing to hire, different people. There's ways to add more seats to the table, right? Than to just have the one. I don't think it's enough to just have one diverse person. I always say, as a Black woman, I don't speak for all Black people. I don't speak for all women. I have Victoria's point of view and view of the world. And so it's so refreshing to look around and see that there are many dimensions of diversity represented. But if you are kind of in your early stages and you don't have the ability to make those type of changes right away, who are your agency partners? What other partners do you bring aboard? Do you have an Eagles Flight, right? Other organizations that can come on and give you different perspective, and that you're open to being challenged, right? You're open to organizations coming in, looking under the hood, looking behind the curtain, so to speak, and finding where there's areas of opportunity. In my past, I've had the opportunity to launch external talent assessments with organizations, and to do that deep digging in your employee data and in the lifecycle data. I've been on other boards where we've done this for a larger number of organizations, and I will say a lot come in a bit apprehensive. They're a little scared to kind of see what's behind the curtain. And I think that's natural. I've seen that a lot of times in human resources. I'll say we, as someone who's also been in HR for a number of years, we own the systems, processes that tend to be broken or that need enhancement. Let's say that need to evolve. And so to own the fact that maybe something is broken or needs improvement is really step one, and not being afraid of that, not saying, oh, we've got to fire someone because we've gotten this wrong. No, it's how do we do better as a group, as a collective. And I think making sure the ELT and the CEO is supportive of that kind of work and not being afraid to go dig and see what you might find. It's unlikely that you'll find the pretty story you think you have. And I think being vulnerable to that is really, really key. And having leaders that are courageous and doing that work is really important.
I think the courage of the leader is critical. The courage of the senior management, but also the frontline leader, because at the frontline level, they're maybe not as comfortable. So if an organization moves in this direction, talk to me about, in your mind, the distinction between giving my frontline leaders a choice in terms of how they are going to alter their behavior, implement diversity priorities, things like that, versus a requirement and metrics that they have to satisfy?
Yeah, I think that happens often for really ambitious organizations. They'll come out the gate strong. They'll set targets and ambitions and metrics in place and require it of leaders. They'll even go as far, which I'm not opposed to this, but I think it's, again, how you do it, not if you do it, but even attaching compensation plans, right, to the work. But what I've seen over time is, how do you hold leaders accountable for something they don't know how to do, right? Making the assumption that people are just going to get it right out of the gate. We've been dealing with things like this in this country for hundreds of years. You're not going to get it right overnight or just because someone says so, right? So I think it is so critical. I know people are exhausted with trainings and things like that, but how else will you learn? Just like you do in any other aspect of your business or education, and continuing that development and learning, bringing in partners and others with that level of expertise, being open to going on the journey. I do think it's most challenging for your kind of mid-level management, right? Typically, very senior leaders, they get it. They know it's the right thing to do. They've been in this work a while. Your employees are yearning for it. They're asking for it. But it puts the mid-level manager in kind of a tight position, right? Because at the end of the day, they want to do right by their people, but they still have a business to run. There's still numbers and metrics that have to be hit for the business, and trying to balance that is not easy. So equipping your leaders with the ability to do that, extending grace when there's mistakes, right? We're not always going to get it right on the first time or even the second time and so on. But that continual education and support to get it right, I think, is really critical. From an HR perspective, ensuring you have the right processes in place that catch those things. Do you have a safe space for employees to share when it's not going well, right? It's not that every single issue is the biggest issue ever, right? But if you're not listening, you can't fix what you don't know is broken. And so I think having that cycle of feedback internally, a safe space for that, is really critical. And then that ongoing education of all of your leaders, always starting at the top is kind of my point of view, but making sure that trickles down throughout all of your leaders in the organization. Otherwise, it won't work because everyone will look at, whose job is it really? It's not my job, it's your job, or I don't know how to do this, And like you said earlier, courage is key. And so it's hard to be courageous in a space you're unfamiliar. You cannot have empathy for what you don't have proximity to. That's a quote, Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, that has just stuck with me. And so how to ensure that your leaders have proximity to difference will help better equip them with knowing what they don't know. I mean, just the other day, actually, I had a leader from a prior organization call. They were going through an interview process at a new company, and he noticed, he's a white male, and he noticed the lack of diversity in every level of how he was interviewing. And actually, he ended up turning down the job. And I was like, why? And he's like, he wanted to be somewhere that was actively trying. That doesn't mean that organization may not be in that process, but he said, now that I've seen that and seen the work, I can't unsee it. And he wanted to be a part of an organization that he knew was trying it at minimum, right? And trying to get it right.
Okay. You've made 3 points just there that I want to grab. All excellent. A few moments ago, you were talking about the ongoing nature, and I think that is critical. If you're going to equip, especially your mid-level leaders, I don't think it's like, okay, we're going to put you in a course today, we're going to train you, and that's it. I think there's got to be an ongoing focus, because they're going to run into issues that the training perhaps didn't cover. It's not something that you can literally do one and done, as you say. It's got to be something like anything else. You're constantly on the road to improvement. So I think the ongoing piece is critical. But I do want to pick up on another point you raised, which was you said the youth are expecting it. So talk to me about how you see the new folks coming into the workforce responding to these priorities, which is, I think, very different from the way perhaps 20 years ago we saw folks coming in.
Absolutely. Often when we think of diversity, we think very, very small, very, gender and race and ethnicity, and that's it. There's so many other dimensions of diversity. And I think one group that often has gotten overlooked, because I think as I was coming up in my career, you always heard about young professionals, millennials, what they want. Gen Z is very different, right, than the generation prior. And so they're going, and I think it's now over the next 2 to 3 years, they'll be a third of the workforce. As they enter what they're wanting from their organizations, they want to know that it aligns to their values. And I don't mean their financial values, right? Their emotional values, what they find important in the world, or they won't work there. They're big on that type of alignment, or they'll move on to the next thing. They're quick to, cancel, right? We know all too familiar about cancel culture. They want to align to that, and they can see through when it's performative and when companies are just saying the right thing or posting the right pictures and things like that on their website, and when they're actually believe it and when they're walking the talk. And they'll be some of the fastest ones to call you out on it, right? Whether it's on social media or internally to the company. And they vote with their feet. If they don't like where they are, they leave. They won't stay. And so if a company, it's really important, again, from an HR perspective, to retain the talent that you have when you're bringing in top talent, young, great talent. How do you ensure that they're coming into a culture and environment that they'll do well in, that they'll survive, that they'll thrive in, and love being a part of? Because they'll be some of your best ambassadors when it comes to recruiting the next wave, right, of talent and or consumers. You want them to feel proud to work there. And so I think that's really important to understand that changing demographic. But I'm actually seeing that passion around wanting to be happy where you are and see it thrive across many generations, even some that are older than me. So I think that's really important that organizations understand that that's important and that they work to get it right. And that's probably not going to happen with our historical, traditional HR practices. And to your point, I think of it as continuing education, just like many of us go to conferences and seminars and podcasts and things like that to continue to learn in our current careers, maybe even in future careers that we're aspirational toward. I think it's important we do the same thing in terms of how we look at talent, how we treat people, how we understand the evolving consumer, the changing demographics of our country, right? And so that if you're the products you may be selling today, who will that consumer be down the road? What's that demographic looking like? What does culture mean? And I don't mean like culture inside your organization. I mean just culture. A lot of times we hear multicultural, but by 2045, we know the minority will be the majority. And so how does culture evolve? What's cool? What's trendy? Who's the tastemakers? Do we understand that today? Or if we keep doing the same thing, you're going to always get what you've gotten, right?
I do agree. I think every generation is very concerned about what I would call the health of the enterprise, the well-being of the organization you work for. Because if the organization is healthy and flourishing, then obviously I have job security and so on. But today's generation would define the success and the health of the enterprise very differently than the previous generation and the generation even before that. That they are more concerned about issues that are very important to the organization, but perhaps weren't top of mind a couple of generations ago. And one of the things I think would be that the younger generation wants to have a voice. They're not content to just come in and just take the status quo. They want to make change. They want to be heard. So chat with me a little bit about your view on that.
Yeah, I definitely think they have an opinion. They have a voice. And they also, I think, are expecting companies to have an opinion, a position, a voice. And I've heard in the past, comments like, well, why can't we sell X? Whether, in my former company, pizza or bourbon, or why can't we just focus on the product? And honestly, it's because times have changed. People want to know where you stand. And so one thing that we put into place at Beam Suntory was really understanding a social impact framework, right? And it was something that took a collective of us to really work together to create effectively across diversity and inclusion, our public affairs team, our comms team, legal, branding. So all these voices were really important to understand how could we plot out world issues, global issues, issues within the United States. When should we speak on it? When should we not? How do you do it? Is it internal? Is it external? Who's the audience to consider? Who internally should we hear from before we take a position, right? Because your leadership team may not reflect all the differences and voices you need. You might need to understand how employees are feeling. And so utilizing your employee resource groups inside your organization is a great way to hear those voices, those opinions. Now, I take that with a grain of salt. You might need to hear from various voices. It doesn't mean that just because an employee group said this is what you should do, it might not be the best thing for the business, right? But did you do your due diligence to hear from everyone and understand what the consequences could be of any decision you make. And sometimes no decision can also have negative consequences. It's a lot of times I think companies are shying away from tough conversations and let's just focus on the business. And there can be consequences for that as well. And so I think it's really important for the organization to have those conversations, weigh those consequences, the benefits, and then make informed decisions from there and understand, okay, if this happens, this could be the fallout or this could be the gain. And then I think it's important once you kind of figure out who you are as an organization, almost think of it as your personality, to be consistent. You can't waver. You can't one day go one direction, another day go another direction. And then I think it's important to make sure those that are a part of those conversations have varying opinions that can look at it from multiple sides, whether it's political, social, right, economical. All those things are really important to protect your organization and your brands.
Okay, I'm hanging on to my third point, which I'm going to come to. We've chatted about the need for it to be ongoing and being aware of the youth, but just leading into the third point, which you made, it's a phrase I've never heard, but I want you to expand on in a minute. But the idea of awareness, I think, is critical. What you've just been chatting about, that leaders, especially senior leaders, may feel as though they are fully aware and they are not aware. And it is with awareness of things that you did not know you had no awareness of that you are then able to respond to. So the phrase that you used was proximity to difference, which I think is a very cool phrase, proximity to difference. So talk to me a little bit about that, because that to me seems like a very practical way to translate aspiration into reality. I've never heard that before. So what's behind the thinking there?
So I think often, if you as leaders, and we've gone through various training programs in my career with various organizations, right? But equipping your leaders with understanding, what's their role? Are they being courageous? Do they know what they don't know? Do they know what to do when they don't know what to do, right? And how do you do that? And so, we're all human. We are all a product of our own environment and how we grew up and all of those things. But when you take a step back and kind of look at who's around me, right? Who's inside my circle? Who do I keep in touch with? If they all look like you, about the same age as you, like if you think of, right, all went to the same universities, all go to the same church, you're going to have a very small view of the world. And so how do you expand that? And having proximity to difference helps do that. But you want to do it authentically, right? You want to build authentic relationships with people, build trust. And so it can't be, and I saw this happen a lot during 2020 with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. A lot of people kind of, in COVID, sat us down. I think what was happening opened our eyes and people thought, okay, this is not right. What do I do? Right. But often, a lot of my white peers and colleagues would say, Victoria, I'm seeing what's going on in the world. What should we do? And I was getting so much of that it was a bit overwhelming. I often didn't know which was truly authentic. Do you really want my opinion, or is this just making you feel better? But how do you forge real relationships rooted in trust? Those are the conversations that I think are the most beneficial for you and the person you're speaking with, right? And then are you open to hearing, right? And listening. And sometimes you might need to go back and chew on it a bit, right? Because it's going to be different from what you've experienced. And you're going to have different opinions from different people. But I think exposing yourself to that is very, very important for everyone, though. So even as a Black female, if I were to look in, I've gone through these assessments myself, who's around me? Who are my friends, right? Who did I go to school with? Who's at my church? Is there a variety of difference? And how can I be more intentional about creating it if it's not, right? And so I think you can start to tap some of the difference in your own network to expand that, to put yourself in uncomfortable places. One of my favorite examples of that was at Papa John's. Our new CEO, Steve Ritchie, had just stepped up. I was attending the NAACP convention in San Antonio, and he was flying in to meet me to have some conversations. Right before Derek Johnson and he were going to meet, I was like, Steve, step inside this room and just to get a feel for Derek and who he is. And so it was predominantly African-American, probably 7,000 plus people in the room. And I looked at Steve and I said, oh, it just occurred to me how different he was right in this room. And I said, oh, are you uncomfortable? And Steve said, no, I'm fine. And deep down, I was like, I know you're lying, But I said the way I said the way you feel right now is how I feel every single day. And at the moment, you could see it kind of sink in. He didn't say anything at the time. And then later we were in a meeting, predominantly white male, and he leaned over to me and said, "Wow, Victoria, you're the only woman and person of color in the room." And I was like, "Yes, Steve, all the time, right? Like, this is what I say." He said, "I know, but until now, I didn't see it." And now he can't unsee it. And since then, I've seen Steve do so many different things where he's intentional about who is working in the restaurants that he owns now and how he's staffing, because he sees that difference and can't unsee it. So I've seen a lot of leaders kind of go through that. Not even leaders. I've seen a lot of people experience that now, that once they start to put themselves in those initially uncomfortable spaces, it opens their eyes and they can't go back once they start to experience that.
I think the important thing there is not to confuse exposure to difference with proximity to difference. I mean, you've got to be with it. You've got to empathize. You have to understand. So I'm going to move to another topic in a minute, but something you said, I think that the whole issue of appreciating diversity in all its components is really a subset of understanding the potential within a human being. And one of the things that I believe passionately in and often talk about on these podcasts is the potential within a human being, that as a leader, we are charged with releasing that potential. The board is paying money for the salaries, and the people are coming to work wanting to do their best work every day. And as a leader, my job is to harness that potential in order to optimize the performance. So it includes many things that require that I understand where they are coming from, what's important to them, how they think, how they operate, so that I can actually become much better at allowing them to be all that they are. And I say that because I don't feel that a focus on diversity is a distinction. It is a subset of simply appreciating the worth of every human being for all that they are. Forget where they come from and their background and all those kinds of things. We just need to understand that as leaders, our job is to truly understand what's important to other people so we can allow them to be their best people. And the example you just gave is a perfect example of that. It happens to be in the diversity space, but it is an example of them caring about you, the person.
Exactly. I think those two go hand in hand, right? And I think at some point we might even evolve away from those labels. But I think it's the root of what you're saying, right? How can I truly understand, appreciate, and, unleash the best potential in you if I don't know you, if I don't understand you, if I don't know where you came from, or what lights you up, what's passionate about you, or why you do what you do and how you tick, right? So how do we really get to know each other? And I think culturally, there's some commonality within various cultures that is there, and often, but no group, right, is homogenous. How do you really unleash that without your proximity to that difference, and to really start understanding it, versus you see someone that's different than you think, whatever way you unharness power in one employee can be totally different from another, right? As I've, had my career and built teams, everyone is different. Everyone gets excited about different things. Some people love to be celebrated. Some would rather I just write them a handwritten note, right? Everybody's different, right? How do you unleash that? But you really have to get to know them. No two people are alike. And I think, how do you really get to know your employees, your team, your leaders to do exactly what you said? So I think the work of diversity, equity, inclusion is inside of what you said. And I think if organizations can get that right, you'll be, and we know this, the research proves it out, a far more profitable organization, a more cohesive, inclusive organization. But I think this work kind of sits inside of all of that. That's why I think it's going to be so important as it evolves. And it already is a business imperative, but if leaders understand it to be and execute it accordingly, I think we'll see the progress and the fruits of those labors.
I absolutely agree. I think it does diversity, equity, and inclusion a disservice to give it an identity apart from the larger context. You need to be mindful of the larger whole. Anyway, let's stop here. And coming up next with Victoria Russell on Leading What Matters Most, Victoria will talk to us about the impact of DE&I on attracting talent.
If people externally cannot see that you're walking the talk, living your values and your products, your brands, and your talent, how does that help you attract talent? So if you're saying we want to be more diverse, but we're not, and you'll hear companies say, I can't find the talent, they're not out there. That's not true. Are you casting a wide enough net? Are you attractive to diverse talent?
This has been Leading What Matters Most with Phil Geldart. If you want to create a culture that drives performance and develop leaders that inspire and motivate, go to philgeldart.com. Leading What Matters Most is a production of Forbes Books.